So Diane Abbott, former Shadow Home Secretary, has been suspended from the Labour Party. At the weekend, she wrote an extraordinary letter to The Observer in which she essentially said that Jewish people, Irish people, traveller people can't experience racism. They only experience prejudice. And she even compared the kind of prejudice these people experience to gingers getting abuse in the playground.
I mean, what is going on? How could you have hit send on that letter? It's not just that it's sort of politically unsound, but it was so bizarre to use that kind of comparison. But I don't think it was a mistake, actually. I think the important thing to note is that this wasn't just a blip, that it follows the kind of total dismissal of anti-Semitism and the obsession with literally, almost kind of gatekeeping discussions about racism to only be about through the frame of what happens to Black people and only to do with slavery, and almost playing top trumps with kind of discrimination and oppression throughout history, is just straight out of the playbook of the kind of current anti-racist politics, of which the kind of Black Lives Matter narrative around white privilege and all this kind of stuff. It's become the extent to which if you say anything relating to racism that isn't within that narrative, then you are supposedly you're a bigot. It's not allowed to be said.
Even that being said, though, like the particular historical illiteracy was fascinating. I mean, because of the fact that she was speaking explicitly about the experience of the 20th century, talking about how in the pre-civil rights era South, Jews and Irish people weren't expected to be at the back of the bus, talking about South Africa and apartheid South Africa in a similar sort of fashion.
And she did go right back to slavery as well.
Exactly.
She was quite historically sweeping.
She was, but at the same time, that focus on, you think, what else happened in the mid-20th century? And it's this incredible omission of the greatest crime of history, effectively, is fascinating. And it's the sort of thing where, as you say, in a sense, I don't think this was an accident. I mean, first of all, who writes a letter, even a first draft, as she's trying to claim it is, and it does not reflect her views categorically at all. That's obviously not the particular case. But as you say, you can't help but feel, Ella, that it reflects this broader climate, which is to suggest that anti-Semitism's bad, but it's probably being ginned up. And it's not nearly as bad as this form of racism, which is much more historically permeating and stains our history and so on. This is something a little bit different. And it's, again, the grotesqueness of that competition of victimhood is really striking, but also, as you're suggesting, it's what lays the groundwork for a lot of left anti-Semitism. Not to suggest that Diane Abbott herself is being anti-Semitic explicitly here or anything like that. It's just to say that that's the same kind of seedbed from which that stuff draws. It's like, don't be ridiculous. What are you talking about? And that's something where a lot of that hostility sort of germinates from, definitely.
And it was interesting, even in response to this controversy, you did immediately have the whataboutery. Oh, but what about Islamophobia and the Tories? Oh, what about, interestingly, like a lot of the kind of left-wing people who have even criticised Diane Abbott were keen to talk about actually travellers experienced racism and ignoring the Jewish component.
Yeah, and anyone else who wrote a letter like that about any other group of people other than Jewish people would have been immediately ostracized. There would be no forgiveness whatsoever. I'm not saying that's a good thing, by the way. That's not a good way to respond to things, but there would have been a completely different response.
Yeah, there's a double standard, certainly.
Totally double standard. You had lots of prominent commentators, I saw a tweet from Afro Hirsch, come out and say, she's a woman, she made a mistake, she's apologized, can you all back off? And it's like, as if this was just a kind of slip of the tongue. And, part of the kind of confusing problem is that there is this horrendous mess within the Labour Party. And, you have people saying that this is just yet another kind of Keir Starmer attack on the left within the party, and that really this hasn't got anything to do with a problem with anti-Semitism. It's just a way for him to shuffle off kind of Corbyn's acolytes. And obviously, I'm sure Keir Starmer was delighted to see that letter published, because he has wanted to get rid of people like Diane Abbott in the party. That isn't to have any kind of saying or any kind of consequence on what actually was the content of the letter. And I think the thing with the discussion about anti-Semitism within the Labour Party is there is always someone kind of pointing that way. There's always an excuse. There's always an ulterior motive. There's never any reflection of, actually, do you think maybe you just have a problem with understanding and dealing with Jew hatred? Do you think maybe you just have some kind of blind spot for it, and can you deal with that? Instead, it's always someone else's problem.
And Tom, obviously the background is this broader problem with anti-Semitism. You'd think that all that the Labour Party has been through, all the, the ECHR investigation, only the second party to go through that after the BNP, all the turmoil it's caused them, you just think she'd be a bit more sensitive or clued up about this issue, and yet still she's blundering in. Still, you have the same kind of reaction from the left, as Ella was hinting at, which is to say there must be some ulterior factional motive for people talking about anti-Semitism. How does it keep happening?
Well, I think the problem is it's a fundamental problem not amongst a handful of people who happen to be in the Labour Party on the left of the Labour Party. It's a fundamental problem in the left in general, which is to say that there is this strand fueled by identity politics, fueled by a preoccupation with Israel to the exclusion of all other geopolitical conflicts, obsession with this hierarchy of victimhood, and irritation with mention of anti-Semitism, both historically and today. That's one thing that when Corbyn was still in charge, you would find yourself in radio studios with people, and you would have, say, the chief rabbi coming out and making statements about how left anti-Semitism was a problem, and the bristling that would happen, that would never happen if it was directed at any other group of people who were speaking about the ways in which they felt that they've been suffering from racism and racial discrimination. This is something which is a very clear tendency. It's not just Diane Abbott. It's not just the handful of people who've been kicked out of the Labour Party, or prominent people, I should say. There's a lot of people who've been kicked out of the Labour Party at the lower levels for indulging in these kinds of attitudes. It's just there. And I think in many respects, what shocked a lot of people who otherwise were kind of allies of Diane Abbott, you saw many people actually quite quick to condemn her comments, if not to condemn her personally, is that they saw in kind of unvarnished, unthinking, what a lot of them actually think. I don't think they've ever really seen it stated as starkly and as ridiculously, but this is essentially what they think, that there is this hierarchy of racism, that there is this hierarchy of victimhood. And the problem with that hierarchy is that because it places Jews at the top of it, you end up rehabilitating some very ugly ideas, effectively, about Jewish control, about Jewish privilege and so on. I'm not saying these people have done this explicitly themselves, but it shouldn't surprise you that, again, you see these attitudes kind of surfacing and so on when you do have this really ugly, really divisive competition of victimhood at the heart of your quote-unquote anti-racist politics. It's when you think about it, it's inevitably going to rehabilitate these kinds of anti-Semitic tropes.
I think the most depressing thing about it is that it was in response to an article, and the original article was really actually saying that part of the problem with doing these kind of oppression Olympics, particularly in relation to racism, and not taking into account, the fact of history that, in Britain there used to be signs up that said "No blacks, no dogs, no Irish." That actually there was a lot wrong, and it didn't just happen to one group of people. Is that it was a kind of a call for solidarity. It was saying that actually, if we go down this kind of route of identity politics and sectioning ourselves off and treating each other in a kind of hostile fashion on the basis of suspicion around things we can't change, like our skin color, then there's no chance for solidarity. And then you have Diane Abbott come in and just prove how corrosive and awful that is. And I think we should, actually people should go back and read the original article and think about what all this kind of this horrible kind of genuine divisiveness around identity politics and most importantly around anti-Semitism does for any kind of social solidarity.